Thanks, y'all. I'm going to get us started. So, thank you all for being here. My name is Yvonne Capella-Vickery. I am the Clean Grid Manager with the Alliance for Affordable Energy. The Alliance for Affordable Energy is a consumer and environmental advocate. So we advocate for reliable, affordable energy at the City Council of New Orleans, at the Louisiana Public Service Commission, and we also engage in the stakeholder process at MISO, which is an acronym you probably have heard a lot of this week and last week. All right, so now that I've introduced myself and the organization, we're going to go on to the next slide, and we're going to cover, oh, sorry, Emma, could you go back one? We're just going to go over the agenda really quickly. All right, so just a couple of housekeeping items. This informational meeting is really intended for people who pay a utility bill here in South Louisiana at Entergy or CLECO, and for consumers. So we are here today to answer questions to the best of our ability. We don't have all of the answers. We wish we did, but that is why we're here today. So we really want to put those that were impacted by this outage at the center of this presentation. With that said, if we have any members of the media, could you please identify yourself in the chat with your name and organizational affiliation? That would be very much appreciated. Also, a couple of other housekeeping notes. We hope that you all came with questions. Before we answer those questions, we are going to present about a 10 to 15 minute slide deck that we hope will be informational, and then we'll leave the rest of our time to questions and answers. The panelists of folks who will try and answer your questions will be myself, Yvonne Capella-Vickery, Logan Burke with the Alliance for Affordable Energy, Jackson Voss, also with the Alliance, and Andy Kowalczyk with the Southeastern Renewable Energy Association. So also, if you have questions, like we said, we want to answer your questions. However, we would really appreciate it if you could hold on raising your hand until we move to the Q&A session. If you have questions while we're going through the slides, you are more than welcome to type out those questions in the Q&A function via Zoom. So our moderator, Fred, will keep track of those questions. And then once we move into the Q&A session, we will encourage everyone to use the raise hand function, and we will get to your questions as we are able. So also another question that I'm going to answer is, we will share the slide deck today. We will share it as a PDF, likely later this evening or early tomorrow morning. All right, so that said, I think we can move into the meat of the information. All right, so MISO called a load shed event. That is all why we came to this town hall today. On Sunday, May 25th, folks that are in the Entergy territory, Entergy New Orleans, and Entergy Louisiana, as well as CLECO, were about 100,000 people were without power. And there's very little notice to know that we were going to be without power. I myself was cleaning my grill, getting ready for Memorial Day weekend grill, as I'm sure many of us were, and had a couple of family members who usually don't show up early, show up a whole hour early because they didn't have power. So they came on over to my house. Luckily, we did have power, and they were able to cool off and start to ask questions about why it was that they didn't have power on a hot, sunny day. Let's see. So my so-called a load shed. Emma, can you go back really quickly? Sorry, thank you. So a load shed event is a last resort option that the grid operator takes to intentionally reduce demand on the power grid. This is all about supply and demand and balancing the needs of our electric grid. Put more simply, the grid operator told Entergy and CLECO to turn the lights off in some areas so that there wouldn't be cascading damage to the grid and a larger, longer blackout. Next slide, please. All right, so we've been talking about MISO. We've been hearing a lot of acronyms. What is MISO? MISO stands for not the soup, but the Mid-Intercontinent System Operator. And MISO is, for most of us, this invisible entity, but that ultimately impacts many of our lives on a day-to-day basis. They have many important jobs. MISO is an entity that is kind of like an air traffic controller for our electric grid. So MISO is responsible for managing the reliability of our electric grid from South Louisiana all the way up to Manitoba, Canada. There's 15 states in their footprint. So MISO is working with quite a lot of states and quite a lot of diverse fuel sources and diverse regulatory structures, we'll say. MISO is also in charge of or responsible for long-term regional transmission planning and running the energy market, the annual capacity market, as well as the day-ahead spot market. I won't get into those technicalities, but in any event, MISO helps us to maintain the electric grid and look into the future to understand what kind of power we will need as things shifts and as we move into modernity. Can you go into the next slide, Emma? All right, I'm realizing there's one, sorry, Emma, I'm so sorry. I keep asking y'all to go back and forth. We're gonna go back to the other slide because I forgot about this other important piece. So we just said a lot about what MISO is. MISO existed well before Entergy or CLECO was a member. And actually it was a result of a Department of Justice investigation where Entergy was found to have some anti-competition practices when it comes to their transmission assets. So as a result of this investigation, Entergy had to join an RTO. Ultimately, Entergy chose to join MISO, and Entergy was also directed to sell their transmission infrastructure. That later piece did not happen, but they did join MISO, which is why we're talking about MISO today. Thank you. Next slide. All right, and now I'm going to pass it over to Logan. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Logan Burke, also with the Alliance. So what happened? Well, MISO, as Yvonne has described, directed Entergy to shed demand. Largely, that means to do some controlled blackouts for Entergy and for CLECO, both. This is as Yvonne described, a last-ditch effort to maintain the system before something larger and more catastrophic takes place. MISO doesn't direct or didn't direct the utilities about which areas in particular to shed. Those protocols are up to the utilities themselves. Instead, MISO has the responsibility to maintain the voltage on the system and protect it. So in order to do so, when they discovered that there were basically violations on the system, and in order to protect from larger damage, they directed these two utilities to shed that amount of load. We've got in here a little bit of context because it's really important to think about how much 600 megawatts of power is. Keep in mind, on a hot day, New Orleans Parish itself peaks out at roughly 1,100 megawatts. So 600 is a lot. And so to imagine getting rid of that much customer demand, you've got to look to a lot of parishes. And that's why Orleans, Jefferson, St. Bernard, and Plaquemine, those are all Entergy, Louisiana, and New Orleans, plus CLECO up on the North Shore in St. Tammany, each shed load in various neighborhoods and communities. Next slide. So what we know is that there are only a few reasons you would need to shed some load. Largely, it's because there isn't enough supply to meet the demand, or the supply can't get to the demand because it's unable to move across the transmission system. In this situation, roughly 600 megawatts of demand in South Louisiana could not be met with the power available, which was in North Louisiana and Mississippi. And if you look at this image, You can see in the purple area, and we're going to get back to this map in a moment. You can see in the purple area, that area really indicates that there was power to be had. In fact, the value of that power was in the negatives, and you'll see that again shortly. The value of the power in the red area was in the thousands. And so what we're seeing here is that there was power, we just couldn't get it to where it needed to be. We'll go to the next slide. So why wasn't there enough power where it needed to be? We understand that already, well in advance, Entergy's Waterford 3 nuclear facility was down. We know that in the summer seasons, or rather the shoulder seasons, you've got spring and you've got fall, when there are often outages planned for generation or for transmission to do regular maintenance in the same way that you would do for your car or your AC, for example. And so Waterford 3 was already down. Then the Wednesday before the outage, we learned that the Riverbend nuclear facility went down because there was a leak. And so in order to protect the system, protect that power facility, Entergy powered down that plant to fix this problem. So that power plant was down. What we didn't know until fairly recently was how much power was actually off the grid. It was a lot. In fact, by Sunday afternoon, over 4.5 gigawatts of power, that is a lot of energy, roughly 70% of the generation typically available, was out and unavailable. And that means that even if there had been power, and I'll show you some maps in a moment, basically it couldn't get to where we were. So transmission constraints. We also learned recently that there were outages and overloads on the transmission lines. Transmission lines are the big, large, high voltage power lines that move power typically from power plants to where the demand is. But we learned that there were some transmission lines that were down, one in particular between Mississippi and Louisiana over on the eastern side of the state, that had been down as a result of a tornado back in March. And so when that power was available in Mississippi and couldn't move to South Louisiana, that was part of the challenge. We also know that the weather was hotter than typical and hotter than expected. There have been some guesses about how the forecasting went and why we were unable to guess at the amount of power. So we aren't sure about how that came to be, and that is another question that we need to ask our regulators and have the regulators ask both MISO and the utilities. We can go to the next slide. I wanted to point this out. It's a basic map that identifies where our power generation sits in the state. Obviously, it doesn't identify all of the power that is in Mississippi, in Arkansas, and in Texas, which are our closest states nearby. But I want to point out how much power is available in this area, because this area was very much in the red, and that is where an awful lot of our generation sits, in along the river and in industrial corridors, whether it's the river parishes or even over here in Lake Charles. The point is, even though we have power plants that are in that area, the power was unable to get to where that demand is. You can move to the next slide. So this is the one that I was referring to a moment ago. We pointed out that Riverbend, the nuclear facility, went down unexpectedly. Waterford was already down. We've learned that a lot of other generation in the area was also out unexpectedly. And as a result, it created this traffic jam, if you want to think of it that way, where the inexpensive power that was less than, it went negative in the market. In southern Mississippi, so Grand Gulf Nuclear Plant was up. We know that there were a number of other gas generators available in Mississippi and North Louisiana, but that power just couldn't get to us because we didn't have transmission that could move it to us. Think of it like a highway system that just can't make it into where we live. And we live in a congested area, and that power couldn't make it down to us. And so I will pass it back over to Yvonne.
Hey, y'all. All right, so this type of event has happened in the past. This has happened a couple of times. We had a very quiet Mardi Gras in March of 2021, but there was a load shed event that occurred then. There were also two load shed events that happened in April in the Southwest Power Pool. So the northwest portion of Louisiana is actually a member of a different RTO, the Southwest Power Pool, and about 30,000 people were without power in Bossier and Cato parishes. And what we are still waiting for information. I believe that there will be a report issued in July from the Southwest Power Pool and SWEPCO regarding the details of that. But what we understand today is that transmission constraints. So basically power was unable to reach us, much like what Logan explained on the previous slide that happened here in New Orleans. So these events unfortunately have happened in the past. We've had quite a few in this, in the spring, and it won't be the last load shed event unless we start to deploy solutions. So how do we prevent this from happening again? The good news is that there are solutions. There are short-term solutions and long-term solutions. The short-term solutions are developing and implementing demand response programs. So those are programs intended to kind of edit, for lack of a better word, the way that we are demanding or requesting power. So those programs can look a variety of different ways. Also deploying more diverse resources, like having more access to renewables and battery storage. Battery storage can ramp up within milliseconds. So when, for example, it takes a nuclear facility days to ramp up, battery storage is on not immediately, but very, very quickly. And so having more battery storage is another short-term solution that could assist us. But my favorite long-term solution is building more transmission capacity. I often think of our transmission grid as a highway system, and we need more lanes and we need more highways to move power so that we don't end up in situations where folks in Louisiana are on the hook for very high rates when there was low cost electricity not too far from us in neighboring areas. Next slide, Emma. All right, so who is asleep at the wheel? There's been a lot of finger pointing that has been going on since this load shed event. Some folks want to point the finger at MISO, at our regulators, and at our utility companies. From our perspective, it is our elected regulators. So for folks in New Orleans, that's the New Orleans City Council and your Public Service Commission, and the Mississippi Public Service Commission for those that live in Mississippi, who are in charge of telling utilities what they need to do to have reliable, affordable electricity for consumers. So it's really our elected officials' responsibility to push the utilities to plan long-term transmission capacity so that we can move power around. And it is also Entergy's responsibility to develop a grid that will keep the lights on for all of us. And we need people that are going to actually send strong signals to those entities that are in charge of transmission planning. So we need our regulators here. We have photos of our New Orleans City Council and our Public Service Commission. These are the people that are elected. We elected them to do what is right because they have access to experts. They themselves have spent many years talking about utility issues, and it is up to them to tell the utilities that they need to conduct transmission planning, to develop for example, energy efficiency programs, demand response programs, to develop battery storage. So we are looking to our regulators to hold the utility companies accountable for the situation that they have created. Solutions. So again, we're going to touch on the solutions that are available. In the short term, what consumers can do is hold their regulators and utilities accountable. So what that looks like is making comments, calling your regulator, letting them know how this impacted you, how this load shed event impacted you, and also asking them for solutions. It's really important that we not just ask hard questions today or this week or next week, but that we continue a continuous drumbeat of people who are watching our regulators and making sure that they are held accountable and that our regulators in turn hold utilities accountable. In the long term, in terms of solutions, we have, like I mentioned, long-term regional transmission planning. It is our regulators' responsibility to send signals and to demonstrate that they are open to transmission planning. There are also some very exciting technologies that have been developed that are available called grid enhancing technologies. I won't go into the specifics of what that looks like. There's a lot of resources around that that I would be happy to share with you if you want to email me about that. But essentially, those are technologies that can help the efficiency of how the grid functions. Also, as I mentioned previously, battery storage is another solution that we can deploy. All right, and now we are getting to the part where you can engage, and now I'm going to pass it to Frederick Bell, our Clean Grid organizer. Thank you.
Thanks for the intro, Yvonne. Can everyone hear me? Sounds good. Perfect. Okay, so what can we do tomorrow? If you are available at 10 a.m., it'd be great if we can get as much folks as possible in the doors of to the city council meeting. This is also a joint LPSC meeting, and so we actually are all going to meet in front of the steps on Perdido Street, and so we'll be able to answer any questions you have and chat about how the meeting is going to run. If you can't make the meeting, please scan this barcode and make a public comment or ask a question. Send a link to your neighbors, to your networks. We want to get as much comments and questions in there as possible. Also, there is a LPSC meeting on June 18th in Baton Rouge. You can attend in person, or you can visit the live stream. And also call your representatives. The slide before that Yvonne showed, those are all your energy regulators. And so ask them how to hold energy accountable and other entities that are controlling how you get your power. Next slide, please. So real quick, we're going to do a poll before we go into our Q&A. So if you want to deploy the poll, Emma, then we can kind of ask folks. Thank you.
Yep, should be up for folks now. I think I see some answers coming in.
Yes, thank you guys so much. So the questions are, did your power go out on Sunday? And would you be willing to talk to a reporter about your experience? Cool, cool, cool. Give cool. All right, we have about 50% of folks participating. We can end the poll whenever y'all are ready.
Great. Last call if anyone wants to get their answer in. I'm about to end the poll. See a couple more folks trickling in. Give them one more sec. All right, thanks guys. I'm gonna end it here.
Okay, so we are on to our Q&A portion. Let's see, I think we have 2 questions so far. Get your questions in now if you'd like them answered. Thank you. Our first answer, I don't know if Jackson's already answered this, but it is, what advantage to the consumer is there in being a member of MISO?
Anybody mind? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I can take that. I can take that. So I would say there's a lot of benefits. I think according to Entergy, for every $1 spent, there's $15 in benefits that we as consumers receive. And what do those benefits look like? Because it's not putting $15 in my pocket, right? But what it does look like is one thing is regional coordination. So the coordination that happened between Entergy and CLECO that Logan talked about, where Entergy was asked to shed 500 megawatts, CLECO was asked to shed 100 megawatts. That kind of coordination wouldn't be possible if we weren't a part of a larger RTO. Also, we have, as a member of MISO, we have access to a diversity of options that lower our fuel costs. So we're able to access more affordable grid in certain instances because of our interconnection with the grid. I would also say that at MISO, they are experts in independent transmission planning. So we have access to a group of very intelligent, independent transmission planners who, while yes, regulated for FERC, are not they're not partisan, and so they will show up and do the transmission planning in the way that it needs to be done. So for me, those are all pretty beneficial, right? Coordination with our neighbors, being able to access lower cost electricity, and having access to expert independent transmission planners. Fred, what's our next question?
Thank you, Yvonne. So we kind of have a two-parter question. So why did MISO not get generation up across the rest of the grid to get Entergy customers back up sooner than the hours that it took? It is hard to believe that across the entire MISO grid that all generation facilities are running at full capacity. Entergy needs to inform its customers, media, and government if MISO is not managing the entire grid for customer reliability. So I think basically the question is, why didn't they get it back up sooner than they ultimately did?
I can take that. My name is Andy Kowalczyk. I'm with the Southern Renewable Energy Association, and I'm the transmission director over there. So when the load shed event happened, they were trying to bring the grid back into safe operating limits, and it took about 50 minutes to ensure that the transmission system wasn't going to overload again, which would have caused cascading outages. But to answer the first question, why wasn't there enough generation across the entirety of MISO? There was. In that purple area that Logan indicated in the heat map in the slide deck, there was plentiful generation, but it couldn't get to demand because of transmission constraints. So it's a very critical thing to understand that there are massive transmission limitations in Entergy's system, as well as CLECO's system, because they have for more than a decade basically overlooked the value of long-term transmission planning. They've kind of bucked the benefits around long-term planning. So we do not have long-term transmission plans in place, whereas the north of MISO has planned for more than a decade for 20 to 40 years into the future. They're on their third iteration of a plan, in fact.
Thanks, Andy. There's a second part to this question. Unsure what they might be getting at, but Donald, if you wanted to maybe clarify, did Entergy not want to pay more for electricity from the rest of the grid? Maybe Donald, you could clarify your question. But in the meantime, I'll move on to the next one. How did Entergy choose which areas in New Orleans to lose power?
I can answer that based on what we know from the Mardi Gras outages in 2021. When there was that outage back then, we learned from Entergy that they rate different parts of the city based on critical infrastructure. So for example, a hospital will be on a feeder that is rated at 0, and a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, will be rated at something like 5. So that's sort of the stretch of the ratings. The point of doing that is so that when they plan these outages, or when they set the system to allow these outages, that they will hopefully never ramp down power to things like hospitals and critical infrastructure like the Sewage and Water Board. So what we also understand is that once someone has been sort of rolled off or shed in one of these events, they go to the back of the list for that rating. So that if you were shed in the Mardi Gras 2021 outage, it is highly unlikely that you were shed in this outage. And similar, if there are still areas of the city that haven't been shed for a next time, hopefully there won't be one. So there is a protocol that each utility has. We think it's important that regulators have eyes on what that protocol looks like and communicates with people so that we all have a better understanding of what our risk might look like.
Thanks, Logan. Our next question. Why wasn't Entergy and Clico customers notified prior to outage and communicated with about length of outage?
I can take that, and if y'all, Logan or Andy, if y'all want to add to it, what we understand right now is that MISO themselves had a very short window of time from the moment that they were aware of the severity of the problem and them having to act quickly before it became a cascading outage. So it is very frustrating for us at the kind of very end of this chain to just immediately find out your power's out and you don't have any warning. But from what I understand, I think MISO is trying to figure out internally how they can develop better communication systems so that they can communicate with themselves and also with their members. And by members, in this case, we mean Entergy and Clico. And I think that that's a great question also to encourage your regulators to ask of MISO and of our utility companies.
Yeah, that's correct. So the operations at MISO were dealing with these unplanned outages of power plants. And as they lose more and more pieces of the grid, they need to redirect the power flows. They do that through transmission switching, what they call transmission switching, system reconfiguration. Basically, when you lose access to a major transmission called a highway, we have a really big extra high voltage loop that goes around Louisiana. And because of this outage that Logan mentioned, you don't have access to all the power that's downstream from it. And they need to redirect those flows to lower voltage lines. So they basically create new interfaces to flow this energy from power plants to demand until they lost so many power plants and they lost so many new paths and new reconfigurations and new transmission to switch to that they were white knuckling it all the way through, and they finally just had this really hard decision to make. But during that, they were working their butts off, and they were dealing with this compromised system. And I think that the answer that we're going to hear from MISO is that they probably should have said something when things started to look a little hairy. I think that happened between Friday and Sunday, that they started to see the congestion on the grid and the unplanned outages just mount to be so big that eventually they just kind of there was nothing more that they could do with an underinvested and generation compromised system that Entergy and Clico have been attempting to maintain for a very long time.
I want to address something that Andy and Yvonne were both referencing, and then also actually a question that I see in the Q&A, and tie them all together a bit. We mentioned that a significant amount of generation was out, and that was both planned outages and unplanned outages. Some of that is not owned by Entergy or Cleco. There is generation that is in our, or at least that's what we understand, that there is generation in our state and in most states that isn't just owned by utilities. And so we can assume, until we get the data, that some of those outages might have come from non-utility owned power generation. We will find that out in a couple of months when that data is made available. Right now, that information is market sensitive, but it's going to be really important for regulators to ask that question.
Thanks, Logan. I think that answered a couple of these questions. So we're going to go to the next one. What is the transmission plan for New Orleans? Does it need to change to deal with the situation where we can't transmit surplus energy from another area on the grid when we need it?
That's a great question. So the transmission plan currently is, I would say it's kind of tied up in trying to decide who pays for what. So I mentioned that MISO is responsible for long-term regional planning. One of the things that makes New Orleans very unique is that New Orleans, among many things that make our city so unique, is that we are a transmission island. So most of our power that comes into the city has to cross waterways through transmission lines to get to us. And in order for New Orleans to reach our renewable portfolio standard goals and to have a more reliable grid, we need to create more connections with our neighbors and within Louisiana. So what that looks like is there's a process happening at MISO called the long-term regional planning process. That process has been going on since 2020, and our regulators in what we call MISO South, so that's Louisiana, most of Mississippi, Arkansas, and a small portion of Eastern Texas, are all a part of MISO South. So each commission has one person that acts as the representative to the RTO, and they all get together to try and decide how it is that we are going to pay for long-term regional planning. So far, our regulators haven't been able to come to any agreement. And so because of that, we haven't really had access to long-term regional transmission planning. And this is where we really need to push our regulators to fight for real transmission planning to begin now. It takes a very long time from when planning starts to when we actually have new infrastructure in service and functioning. It can take 10 years. So really, it would have been great if we started on this 10 years ago or even more, but that didn't happen. So we have to make the best of the situation that we have now. And what that looks like for me, in my opinion, is our regulators indicating very clearly that they are ready to come to the table and to plan long-term transmission planning. I don't know if Andy or Logan have anything that y'all would like to add to that for some extra flavor.
This is something that I've spent too much time on for the last 4 years. I mean, you mentioned to people that like what the grid planning is waiting on is cost allocation. Their first thought is like, what is that? Their second thought is, that sounds boring. But it's highly contentious. And there have been so many meetings that turn into just like the whole purpose of some of these meetings for some of the consultants that are speaking on behalf of the City Council of New Orleans or the City of Louisiana, or the Louisiana Public Service Commission, or Mississippi, seems to just be to reject MISO's current cost allocation process, which is approved by FERC and has been in place for over a decade, and has facilitated 3 large-scale regional, long-term regional transmission planning efforts. If you look back to 2010, that was the first one. That was called the multi-value planning process across the North Midwest in MISO North. And now we have 2 more that have been planned and approved, and now they're going to the state process. But we've had none of that planning in MISO South, and it's because of this gap where the southern regulators say they don't accept the multi-value planning tariff, the cost allocation that is accepted by FERC and used by all the northern by the northern footprint of MISO, but they have not found a replacement for that. Now, that is something that's currently under discussion right now, but MISO South regulators have not signaled what they've not provided a proposal for cost allocation. What they've done is just said, we don't like these things, which is not a cost allocation. So that's what we're really missing before MISO comes to the table and they're like, okay, now we want to spend more than a year identifying all the issues and proving that this is going to come at a cost savings to consumers, because that's exactly what they've done 3 times in MISO North.
So what we need is regulators who in Louisiana are elected, Mississippi are elected, to work together to make decisions about this sticky question so that planning can get underway. And in order for them to do that, they need to hear from all of us that this is something that we really value and is really important to all of us.
Thanks, Shaw. We have a couple more questions. So, were there any transmission enhancements, such as real-time monitoring of the line conditions, that could have been implemented to reduce some of the constraint on the transmission lines?
I think they have some StatCom deployment, so they do understand real-time conditions. And I do believe that there's some ambient adjusted ratings that are applied to some lines. But from what I've heard from MISO, they were beyond that point. They were taking all the capacity that they possibly could. I also heard from some of our developers over at SREA that there could be things on the system that essentially capture additional capacity. They're called wave traps. And the purpose of wave traps is they do exactly that. They trap a certain set of frequency so that they can communicate in between. They filter out like a certain amount of the frequency, and then they let some of it through, so they can communicate conditions on the grid better. Sometimes they use fiber optic cables. That's another thing that's part of the process of interconnecting things. But short answer to your question, it would be great to deploy more grid enhancing technologies and dynamic line ratings. And I think it certainly doesn't hurt. And I would love to see that get a little bit more juice at like the legislative level and at the Public Service Commission to demand that Entergy and CLECO integrate more grid enhancing technologies, because it provides a little bit more headroom on the grid, and it's good for our developers too. So, yeah.
Okay, so forgive me if this question was already answered, but why did Entergy continue to plan the shutdown at Waterford if the transmission line was down?
A nuclear plant outage still requires, if they're in the middle of a maintenance shutdown, they still have to continue and finish whatever that investment, that upgrade maintenance is. Furthermore, it takes a few days for a nuclear power plant to come online. It's a really, no, you're, Andy, sorry.
I'll answer the question. Sorry. That's not how you do. That's not how you answer the questions in the chat. Apologize.
Oh, okay. So even if Entergy had seen that there was an outage on the transmission system, it couldn't have brought that nuclear plant up quickly enough.
Thank you. I noticed MISO, unlike other grids, extends from high demand area in Louisiana to lower demand, cooler areas in the north. Why is there not more proactive transmission planning in the areas most likely to be affected?
I can take that. I think we've kind of already started to answer that question. So MISO has a very large footprint, and MISO has undertaken long-term regional transmission planning in geographic areas. Basically, folks down here couldn't agree, and so MISO said, all right, well, we're just gonna plan where we can get some agreement. And so the kind of more north footprint of MISO has they've done two groups of projects. They call them tranches. And so there's been tranche 1 and tranche 2.1, where a lot of these long-term transmission projects have been approved. They're now in the process of going through the state approval process. But essentially, our utility companies haven't advocated for that kind of transmission planning, and our regulators haven't pushed the entities that they regulate, the utilities, to do that transmission planning.
I'll also add that there is a glimmer of hope in the near term. There is currently an interregional planning effort between MISO and the Southwest Power Pool, where they're looking at transfers from the Southwest Power Pool, large energy transfers. And again, they're missing this cost allocation piece. They've identified like transfers, and now they're kind of building the benefits case. There's a lot of great benefits to connecting to the Southwest Power Pool. You get access to world-class wind resources. There's a giant wind belt in the middle of the country, and SPP can get up to like 70, 80% wind at times, which is really incredible. I won't say that it's all perfect in SPP because they still have a lot of coal resources, but they do have a lot of wind resources that are plentiful at times of the year like this. And it probably could not get through this barrier, though, like in this event in particular. Now, not all events are the same, though. We could have an event that, again, hits like the northwest of Louisiana, and that could be really helpful. The idea is that the more integrated the transmission network is, the more flexible and the more nimble it is, and the more adaptable it is. And I think the same thing is true of just like our generation fleet right now. We're really nuclear and gas heavy. And those resources, like the more of them you have, the more like the risk profile is exactly the same. It's like a very homogeneous sort of profile of these resources. But if you put solar in there, and if maybe you put wind in there too, like you're playing to a number of different strengths. You're having, maybe a reliability event during the day like what we had on May 25th, and the sun is out. And solar would be really great to have. And energy storage would be really great to have too. So it's just about having a diverse fleet of resources.
Nice job with the questions, y'all. I'm going to answer some questions from the chat. Given that utilities receive very short notice to shed load from MISO, is there a plan or technology in place to improve advanced notification to consumers, perhaps via text or preemptive warnings or zone-based forecasting? What stopped this from happening?
That is a great question. And what you're describing there is something related to what we call demand response. And it just basically means sending signals, whether it's a market signal or a direct signal, to energy users to reduce their load. This is actually something that worked well back in the day before the Mardi Gras outage. You might remember having gotten a text message or two about not running your laundry. Those are things that actually can really contribute to reducing demand on the system. Those are kind of active things that can happen. There are other programs already in place with a lot of industrial customers, although it wouldn't have solved the entirety of the problem. Here in Louisiana, Entergy has roughly 250, I believe, megawatts available to them of industrial load, industrial customers, who can be called on to turn down their operations. These industrial customers are already getting a deal on their bill in order to have, this kind of back and forth. But the requirement is that there's got to be more planning and more heads up. I think one of the things that is most frustrating about this example is that it happened so quickly. And it seems that MISO and Entergy were working to try and patch it together and try and keep it up and running, but didn't communicate in enough time that any of those things could have happened. Another thing that has been suggested was that potentially if there was a gas plant that could have been turned on. Again, the problem is between 3 and 30 minutes, you can't get that kind of resources up and running. But as Yvonne said earlier, things like batteries certainly do. You should know, if you're living in Orleans Parish, that the city council right now is considering a program that would help distribute batteries to homes and businesses and institutions so that those kinds of things could be part of the solution. We need every tool in the toolkit in order to address these things in the short and the long term.
All right. Let's answer this one. This is also in the chat. Can Entergy and or Clico opt out of load shedding, or are they required to participate?
They are required to participate in the load shed event. As I mentioned earlier, they called this load shed event it was a controlled outage. So basically they said, okay, we have an outage in this small area, or we potentially deal with major cascading outages. And those cascading outages can result in like some pretty like physical damage. We had a conversation with somebody who works, in transmission build out, and we're saying that if there's big cascading events, depending on how bad it is, can actually break wires and require linemen to go and reinstall that. So it is something that is required. They cannot opt out. MISO also has to implement these load shedding events in order to maintain NERC reliability standards, which are very important national standards that have to be maintained in order to maintain the health and reliability of the electric grid.
Awesome. Next question, really good one. Is there anyone coming in asking and advising about medically energy dependent populations in these talks?
That to me sounds like a really good question from the public to regulators. Regulators, city council, public service commissioners need to hear from lots of different kinds of people, not just those of us who are talking here. And so I would encourage you, the person who asked the question, to submit a comment to the council and to the commission about this issue. This is really important and is one of the things that can be addressed with things like distributed solar and storage, and needs to be part of those kinds of programs.
And next question, will the Alliance hold a town hall when the MISO report comes out?
We most certainly will. So as I mentioned, there was a load shed event that happened in Northwest Louisiana in the Shreveport area, and that report will come out in July. So I think what our plan right now is that the Alliance will host kind of a big webinar where we discuss what we have learned about the Southwest Power Pool outage in Northwest Louisiana, and when we have more information about the load shed event that happened here in the greater New Orleans area. So we will, we also have a blog that we will continue to update as we find more details and as we have more updates for the public. We also have released an open letter where we outlined questions that we think the public has a right to have answers to. So that is also something that will be available on our website tomorrow. And so that will also be another place that houses a list of questions that we think it's really important for consumers to ask of their regulators and their utility company.
All right, we got a couple more rounding it out. This one was in the chat. Are they saying the transmission line damaged by a tornado in March will be repaired in time for summer temperatures?
Not that I know of. It was actually over in Jennings too. It was connected to Plant Nelson over there, which is a big old gas plant that's probably going to retire soon. But yeah, we need to get clarity on what the status is, because we've had similar sorts of issues like that. Sometimes they're minimal flows. It was a perfect storm with this one. There was a lot of unplanned outages, and I think that coming out of shoulder season, we're going to have more plants available. So that's a little bit of comfort. But yeah, no, it's something to get some clarity on.
One other thing that I just want to point out about why we are constantly talking about having the transmission needed is it's not just in extreme circumstances like this that it matters. Those congestion costs that you saw on the map, the difference between the purple and the red, that can happen year round, even if it never shows up as a load shed event. That congestion shows up on our bills year round in the hundreds of millions of extra dollars that we're all spending. And so this is one of those things that yes, it is about making sure that we have access to lower cost renewable energy. Yes, it is about making sure that when there are unexpected events on the system that people can stay up and running, but it is also about everyday affordability and making sure that we can all just keep the lights on that way.
And you can see what's happening on the grid too. Like MISO has a real-time monitor, like showing the spot prices throughout their market, and they fluctuate as there is a divide in the prices. And sometimes this indicates that there are transmission constraints and there's an inability to import more affordable energy. And you can see this in stark contrast too when you see a high wind day, like say in the north, and there's abundant wind, and there's maybe like really increased demand. You can see that there's maybe more transmission that needs to be built, and that's why MISO has been undergoing this effort in the north to unlock that more affordable energy. But it doesn't matter what kind of energy it is. If it can't get to where it's going to go, it's going to cause congestion, and it's going to be more valuable where it's needed than where it's being produced if there's transmission constraints in front of it.
All right, another really good question that we should talk about before the meeting tomorrow. I saw this as a suggested question to regulators, but I'm unclear what it means. Can you expound? How much additional revenue did Entergy make from the load shed event?
So that was related again to those differences in costs, that revenue, additional revenue for the power that was sold in the constrained area. Basically, the utility or anybody who owns a generator that was able to move power into the system when it was over $1,500 a megawatt hour, that just means really, really expensive, when typically it's 20. It means that Entergy had a bunch of additional revenue to pay for, there we go, great, thank you, Emma, to pay for the power that was sold into that system. So the question there is going to be to our regulators. Does this mean that Entergy had additional revenue, and how is that going to impact all of our bills? Because if Entergy is paying more for the power or receiving more money for the power as a result of the constraints, that means that potentially the cost of on our bills in 2 months on the fuel adjustment charge will begin to show up. This is always what happens when there's as big an imbalance as there is right here.
And Logan, can you expand on that? Why are we paying those costs and not Entergy? Is it because we pay for most things that Entergy is doing?
It's as simple as that. Yeah. We pay for everything Entergy and Clico use. We pay all of the fuel. We pay power that they buy in the market. We pay for the generation and the transmission and the distribution. We pay their taxes. We pay for absolutely everything. And so if a cost goes up in the market that is out of Entergy's hands, or even if it is, those costs get passed on to us on our bills.
I do want to add really quickly that they will get dinged in the planning resource auction. That is the yearly auction that they hold for this event, because they do determine the credit applied to, I'm trying to put this in as much lay term as possible, but they apply credit to resources based on how they perform. And MISO has revised this to look at risk hours, like these hours where you have extreme demand, or you have like even events like this that determine the performance of resources during that time. So when you have unplanned outages like this, and in this great of a quantity, they are going to reduce their accreditation for these units. So why they do this, why MISO does this in the capacity auction, is it provides a good signal for regulators of what we need to build and when we need to build it. Renewables typically get a lesser accreditation, but in this case, solar would have been really helpful. We had disagreements with the accreditation construct, but we do believe that it's necessary to hold performance accountable, to ensure that we're looking at the performance of these resources that are in the fleet, and that we're not just saying like, we expect them to perform at this year after year.
Thanks, Andy. Let's see. What are the common causes of unplanned outages?
There are a few. I'll jump in with a few, and then I'll pass it over to my colleagues here. So some unplanned outages, for example, in extreme heat and extreme cold, plants can simply not operate in the conditions. For example, if it is particularly cold during Winter Storm Uri, we saw that some of the gas plants were unable to operate. We saw that some of the coal plants, literally piles of coal, were frozen and couldn't be used to generate power. Other things that can happen is on the transmission system. If something is forced out, it's because basically there's too much demand, too much power trying to flow on a single line. Another thing that we've seen is in Virginia, there were a number of challenges both last summer and then in February as a result of some data centers. Basically, an enormous amount of load of data centers basically went offline. A lot of demand. Imagine roughly the city of New Orleans just disappearing from the energy demand. That can have basically, I don't want to use the word cascading in this sense, but the impacts can travel up the line and can cause other things to be impacted in terms of voltage and so forth. So there are lots of different things that can impact the grid, which is impressively balanced, frankly, despite all of the sort of hairpin turns. Andy or Yvonne, do you want to jump in on any other causes for unplanned outages?
Lack of access to fuel. So if you don't have import capacity for natural gas, you are stuck. And like, this is something that happened over the weekend for Christmas. A couple of years ago with Winter Storm Elliott. It also happened to a pretty big degree in Winter Storm Uri. Just there is a whole discussion that's been happening for over 2 decades, basically, about electric and natural gas harmonization. And that just means that there is greater communication and greater coordination between the natural gas transmission system and the electric system. And really, it hasn't moved too much. You basically have a natural gas market and you have a electric market that is dependent on having enough gas supply. But yeah, these weekend events are really funny because they basically shut off the gas market, and you have to stock up on all the gas that you need over the weekend. And when it happens on a holiday weekend and there's a big event and you're not prepared for it, like you don't have access to gas and you can't run your gas generators. So that's one big cause of unplanned outages. Just environmental conditions, though, is another one where it's like if you have thermal power plants and they have to run really, really hot, like sometimes it's too hot and sometimes you run into bigger complications, like with a nuclear facility or a coal facility, that the whole like operating characteristic is that they have to get really, really, really hot. And they have, in addition to that, like thousands of moving parts within them. So that's thousands of little pieces of risk where things could go wrong. So I don't know, just boosting my own industry, not saying that solar or energy storage or wind are perfect and they're available even when it's not windy or when the sun isn't out. I know for a fact that that's not true. But there are advantages to having less moving parts and not as frequent maintenance. So I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Will the Meta data center make this worse? I heard they plan to use a lot of power. Who wants to take this one? Oh, it's a big one. Sorry.
We don't know. Like, I will say that it is super concerning what Logan just mentioned about the data centers and the size of data centers and when they lose demand. When you lose demand or you lose generation, it creates a huge strain on the grid. There is a NERC task force. That's the North American Electric Reliability Council. They basically produce electricity standards so that you are not creating massive disturbances on the grid with different behavior in your reaction to different challenging operating conditions. And NERC is directed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to develop standards sometimes. Right now, they're in the development process for an extreme weather, basically preparing the transmissions system and planning for extreme weather conditions, for an example. But they've started this large load task force, which is dedicated to these large spot load additions like data centers that are like the size of cities in terms of their electricity demand. And MISO is a part of that task force, as is the Electric Reliability Coordinator for Texas, ERCOT, which I think people got to know really well during Uri, as is Entergy and Southern Company. But the purpose of these task forces is not to listen to one side, and NERC will take this feedback from all the utilities and from all the reliability coordinators and come up with an independent enough assessment to determine what the planning process is that we should be using going forward. All this planning guidance will come out in the next year, and I don't know that that's necessarily applied to Meta. So I do have some concerns. Talking with MISO, they've said that the transmission that's being built for Meta could actually be really helpful to North Louisiana, but I always like to trust but verify with things, and I think that's always a good way to roll. So
one of the things that we are very concerned about with the Meta facility is that, like most customers, the people who look at and plan and have a sense of the grid, manage the grid, there's no real understanding of how those load shapes work. Basically, that means we don't know if they're going to run full out AI computing in the middle of the day when it's really hot and everybody's got their AC on. We don't know if they're going to run it at night. We don't know if they're going to ramp it quickly up and down. And those things actually have a huge impact on, as Andy was saying, how the grid operates. And so this is something that we are really encouraging our regulators at the Public Service Commission to ask those questions and to push on that so that we've got better insight, so that MISO has better insight into how to operate the grid around it to keep everybody safe.
yeah, MISO will get a little bit of idea how to do that. It's just a matter of sometimes there's this market sensitive lingo that they throw around about, like, we can't tell you how we operate because that's market sensitive information. And it's like, because it's like optimizing when they use the grid and their power prices and stuff like that. But when it affects you and me and everyone else and people who are on breathing machines and stuff like that, like, it's public information. Yeah.
All right. I think we're gonna round it out with our last question. What is the hold up on agreement over cost allocation? Is it correct? Is it a correct takeaway that the regulatory parties can't agree on who pays how much for long-term planning? So the parties that pay is us, the consumers, for the lack of planning to ensure that transmission flows. There's also another question I guess we can just answer with that. Are you saying that there is no long-term energy transmission plan for the grid because regulators, city council, and Entergy are unwilling to pay for it? What is the negative impact of not having a long-term plan, and how did it impact this recent load shed event? To round us off.
All right. Yes. So Laura, your takeaway about cost allocation is correct. Essentially, our regulators in this MISO South area can't agree on the tariff, basically trying to determine what percentage of an entity pays for the transmission infrastructure that would eventually get built. So what we need is we need our regulators to not just push off a cost allocation decision. We need our regulators to show up to what is called the Entergy Regional State Committee meetings. We need them to not just rely on consultants, but to really take a good look, because getting to the other question that I believe Winston asked, the price that we pay is the load shed event that we experienced, that kind of thing could continue to happen and could potentially be linked to a lack of transmission planning. So basically, we are on the hook for continuing to pay for Entergy to build out a grid system that benefits their power plants and not a larger system. So this is something that does cost us the longer that we wait to actually get transmission planning and a cost allocation agreement.
Yeah, I think it's a few things. It's like, You're missing out on resilience because you're missing out on the ability to import electricity from places that are less impacted. That is going to be cheaper and also provide just that extra capacity that you need when you're going through a reliability event. Also, you're missing out on the diversity of different kinds of generation that you could have with a more durable grid, like they're planning in the north. And finally, you're just missing this incredible buffer that you have to ride out these events where we just don't have enough capacity. Where, like, you had this constraint north of Lake Pontchartrain that we were seconds away from having a event that could have, spread to be like statewide or a couple states. Like, we were looking at a reliability event like what they had in Spain very recently. And MISO is not perfect by any means, but the decision that they made was critical to our way of life and to public health and safety. And they made the decision that they had to ensure that we wouldn't be enduring weeks of power not being there.
Thanks, Andy. And I know I said that was the last question, but if someone can answer this in 30 seconds before we move to the take action slide again. Let's see. This may be unrelated, but is there any relation with the outage and Delta Utilities starting this summer?
No, Delta Utilities is really only going to be managing the gas distribution system. That is the gas that comes to your home and businesses for things like heating and cooking and hot water. Delta Utilities, we expect, is interested in selling you more gas. But in terms of how the grid is impacted, that shouldn't have any intersection.
Thank you, Andy, Logan, and Yvonne for answering all these questions. I want to thank everyone that came to our webinar today. And I'll ask Emma to bring up our take action slide again. So once again, tomorrow, if you guys can attend the joint city council and LPSC meeting, again, we're going to meet at 9:30 on the steps on Perdido. But if not, make sure you make a comment and ask questions. Make sure you scan this QR code right now to bring you straight to that form. Again, there is a June 18th LPSC meeting in Baton Rouge where you can also look at it on a live stream. And as always, call your representatives. There's a slide with all of your regulators from City Council to LPSC, and continue to ask them to hold utilities, Entergy, and MISO accountable. Thanks so much, y'all, and have a great evening. Here's our Facebook, Instagram, website, and email information in case you have more questions or want to figure out how you can stay connected to whatever we're doing when it comes to these issues. All right.
Thanks for coming, y'all. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you, guys.
Thanks, y'all.
All right, bye.